By choosing to spend your money on luxuries, you are leaving a child to die. A child you could have saved. Imagine that everything you knew about morality was a lie. That in fact, most people you know are, morally speaking, evil. And there is a vast stain on your very soul. We all like to think of ourselves as good people. It's hard to live with ourselves if we do not. But according to Australian philosopher and ethicist Peter Singer, we are all in fact falling far short of our moral responsibility to our fellow man. And are essentially a group of selfish, egotistical murderers who are consciously letting innocent people die every second of the day. This is the most controversial paper in modern ethics, and I hope that you'll explore it with me. We will learn why almost everyone watching this video is evil, myself included, how our moral intuitions lead us to ignore atrocities, and how we can all have a greater impact on the world than we might think. But what does this scandalous paper actually say, and does it hold up to scrutiny? Well, that is just what we shall look at first. 1. Famine, affluence, and morality. Picture this. You are on your way to work or school one day when you pass a shallow pond. There is a small child playing quite merrily in the pond, and this brings a smile to your face. After a moment, you notice that the child has fallen over, and as they cannot swim, they will surely drown. You look around and you can't see the child's parents, meaning that if you don't do something, they will die. However, you are wearing your brand new suit that you paid quite a bit of money for, and if you wade into the pond to save the young life, you will ruin this nice possession. What do you do? Almost everyone watching will probably say that they would jump in and save the child. Moreover, if somebody didn't do that, we would almost certainly judge them harshly as being in some way immoral. If they said that they didn't want to save the child because it would ruin their new suit, this would do nothing to alleviate our condemnation, and we would view them as a borderline sociopath. As far as our moral intuitions are concerned, the right path is clear. We should wade into the water, save the poor child, and give not a moment's thought to our new suit. And in his paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, this is where Singer springs his philosophical trap. He says that many of us are in exactly the same position as the person walking past a drowning child. A lot of the people watching this video will live in middle-income or high-income nations. And as a result, they will be, on a global scale, really quite well off. But in other parts of the world, innocent people are dying of entirely preventable diseases all the time. And according to Singer, we have the power to save them. By the calculations of another philosopher, Peter Unger, it would cost about $200 to save someone's life, provided that money was donated wisely. Others have put the figure higher at about $3,500. But the overall message doesn't change for Singer. Many people spend this much or far more on luxury purchases every year. For example, a few years ago I bought a nice new pair of boots for roughly £250, which took me a while to save up for. I have greatly enjoyed having these boots. They are very comfortable and they stop my feet getting wet when it rains, which, because I live in the UK, is almost every day of the year. However, would I really say that these boots are worth more than a person's life? Obviously not. But then I have a moral dilemma on my hands. How on earth could I justify buying these boots if the same money could save someone's life? For that matter, how could I justify any luxury purchase when the money could be doing far greater good elsewhere? Peter Singer says I cannot justify this. And he states that myself and many people like me who indulge in the occasional luxury purchase are in fact failing in our moral duties and living far below the moral standard required of us. We may all collectively ignore this fact to rescue ourselves from unbearable cognitive dissonance, but nonetheless, he claims it is true. He argues that the situation of the drowning child is analogous to ours in all relevant respects. Many of us have the potential to save lives at only moderate cost to ourselves, but we choose not to. Thus, if we would condemn the man who walks past a drowning child to save his suit from getting muddy, we should also look in the mirror and condemn ourselves for letting a proportion of the world live in abject poverty while we buy nice new boots. It is difficult to think of a philosophy paper with a more radical conclusion than this. Peter Singer reaches out from the page to tell us directly that we are failing in our moral duties. This is what makes the paper so exciting. And the argument is impactful because it follows from relatively simple premises. Explicitly stated, Singer's argument is the following. 1. If we can, at no significant moral cost to ourselves, save a life, then we should do. 2. By donating any money we would spend on luxury purchases to effective charities, we can, at no significant moral cost to ourselves, save a life. Conclusion. Therefore, we should donate any money we would spend on luxury purchases to effective charities. The drowning child argument serves to establish premise 1, and Singer argues for premise 2 by looking at the work done by effective charities. In some other articles, Singer elaborates on this claim by pointing to a number of charitable endeavours that have indeed achieved great things. And the conclusion to this simple argument is much more radical than you might believe. And that is just what we will move on to next. If you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. 2. Radical moral consequences. The philosophical field of ethics has been traditionally defined as the study of how to live a good and moral life, and no paper in recent history has demanded quite so much of us as Singer's one does here. In the strictest version of Singer's argument, when he says that we should give until we lose something of moral significance, he means something of comparable moral significance to a person's life. Doing this would necessitate many of us in more affluent nations to completely change our lifestyle. For instance, today my gym membership was renewed for roughly £17.99, and I get a lot of pleasure from it. It keeps me healthy and I enjoy exercising. But that money could contribute to an operation that reversed the blindness caused by cataracts. Or it could buy a malaria net that could save someone's life. So can I really justify this purchase when the same money could do real good for real people? And you can repeat this argument for any purchase that isn't just the basic food, water and shelter that we need to survive. Some people influenced by Singer's paper have taken this view to the absolute extreme. One person has given away most of his wealth to charity and even donated his kidney to a stranger. Each time he was unable to justify to himself the prospect of hanging on to his luxuries, or even his organs, when they could be doing good for others. And I really want to emphasize here that Singer does not just say that it would be nice if we gave away more of our wealth to charity. He thinks it is our moral obligation. That is, we are not just earning extra bonus morality points if we donate most of our income to charitable causes, but we are doing something actively immoral by not doing so. So, by letting my gym membership renew rather than giving to a worthy cause, I am doing something actively morally wrong. I am sinning, in the purely secular sense of the word. Strictly, what Singer demands of us is not to cut back on luxury purchases, but to eliminate them entirely. That is the moral standard demanded by his paper, and what makes it such a radical thing to argue. And on first reflection, it is difficult to say exactly what is wrong with Singer's argument. He admits his conclusions are counterintuitive, but he says this is because our intuitions are more geared towards selfishness than morality. Singer is a utilitarian, which means he thinks that whatever is good is what maximizes gross well-being. And if you think this, it is a relatively short series of steps to get to his radical conclusions about our spending habits. And Singer points out that while this conclusion might be far-fetched now, it is by no means without precedent. He points this out with reference to various religious traditions. He says that early Buddhist thinkers were emphatic about their followers giving much of their money to charity, both for the well-being of the giver and the receiver. He quotes a well-known passage from Christian philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas, who argues that Christians should give away all of their excess wealth, and whatever luxury money they have is owed to the poor and needy. It is important to recognise here that Singer's remarks are ethical and they have political implications, but that he largely focuses on the individual level. He is not saying the state should redistribute wealth in the way some socialist thinkers have argued, nor is he calling for the downfall of the profit-generating economic system of capitalism that allows for these luxury purchases, as some communist thinkers have wanted. He instead thinks that, individually, we are morally compelled to give away much of our money. Peter Singer is not going to ask the state to come round and nick your TV, but he is arguing that we should donate any money we would further spend on TVs. I only mention this because Singer is often offhandedly referred to as a communist, and I don't think that quite represents his philosophy accurately. So, now we have elucidated the radical consequences of Singer's argument, we can begin to consider criticisms of it. Now, obviously, many of us have a vested interest in this argument being proven wrong, so we will have to work extra hard not to simply seize upon the first potential refutation of Singer's position, but instead consider each one critically. The objections to Singer's argument mainly fall into two camps: practical concerns and moral concerns. And I will consider each of these, starting with the practical. 3. Practical concerns. When you think about Singer's argument, isn't there something that strikes you as unrealistic about it? Doesn't it seem at odds with everything we traditionally believe about human nature? Isn't it just baked into our biology that the level of selflessness that Singer demands is unrealistic? This is one of the most interesting practical critiques of Singer's position, though he personally does not see much value in it. According to Singer, questions of human nature simply do not matter for moral arguments. He points out that any attempt to infer from what is the case to what should be the case is an example of the naturalistic fallacy. He even concedes that the amount of moral altruism he thinks we are morally required to display is unlikely to be achieved on a wide scale. But he thinks such facts are irrelevant to the matter of what we should morally do. It may be that human nature is simply not conducive to moral conduct, but all that says is that we are morally flawed beings at the biological level. For Singer, it does not free us from our moral duty. It merely demonstrates that it will be harder to achieve this than we previously thought. And I do think that Singer is a little dismissive here. After all, if ethics is meant to be a guide to our actions, should it not at least try to be practical? This might not matter if you're a die-hard moral realist and you think that what is right and what is wrong is an eternal objective truth, but this is not the meta-ethical position that many of us take. If we can see that ethics is, to a certain extent, a human pursuit aimed at guiding actions, then concerns of how realistic a given ethical proposal is do seem relevant. The strict moral realists among us may not have to worry about this, but for the rest of us, we will have to take the issue of practicality in ethics a little bit more seriously. However, Singer has a further argument against the human nature response. Singer thinks that human nature is a little bit more malleable than we give it credit for. He points to experiments which show that a large influence on how much money people are willing to give to charity is how much they perceive others are giving. We are greatly influenced by the conduct of those around us, and if we feel like we're not doing our fair share in comparison to our peers, this is likely to motivate us to action. Thus, Singer says we should foster a culture of giving, where it is normal to give generously and to be public about this fact, in order to exert social pressure on others to do the same. Singer is a utilitarian, so even if he conceded that we would likely never meet our moral obligations because of our biological natures, he still thinks it is worth getting closer to them, even if this means the careful application of social pressure. The other practical objection often made to Singer's argument is that charitable giving is just not the best way to alleviate these global issues. Sometimes this objection has come from political thinkers who say that nothing short of a total overhaul of the system that causes poverty will be enough, and that Singer's advocation of charity is just a band-aid solution. Other times, economically minded thinkers have argued that charitable donations are often misappropriated, and that they encourage dependency in burgeoning economies. I will not evaluate either argument here because they're both criticizing the implementation of Singer's argument, rather than its principle. We could accept these objections and still agree with the primary conclusions Singer makes, that we owe a lot more than we think to people who are suffering, both in our home countries and abroad. But aside from any practical concerns, some have argued that Singer simply gets morality wrong here. They say that our ethical obligations are much more complicated than Singer presents them, and that giving money to suffering strangers is not only not morally obligatory, but can sometimes even be immoral. These are just the kinds of arguments we will examine next. 4. Moral objections. Let's revisit Singer's scenario of the drowning child and change it somewhat. Let's say that there are two children drowning on one side of the pond and your own child drowning on the other. You only have time to save either the two strangers or your own child. Which do you save? According to Singer's utilitarian logic, you should save the two strangers. And some of the people influenced by his paper have agreed. But there's something about this conclusion that grates on our moral intuitions. Surely we should value the lives of our own children above those of strangers. As Judith Jarvis Thompson argues in one article, a parent who does not put their children first is a bad parent and quite possibly a bad person. They do not have one of the morally compulsory obligations a parent should have. And there are a whole host of objections to Singer's argument that boil down to this. We have greater duties to some people than others, and to ignore this would be immoral, regardless of the consequences. This ranges from a crude form of egoism, which claims that we owe nothing to others and everything to ourselves, to the idea that we owe more to our families or our communities. Either way, the emphasis is taken away from those who might be in more need of help, but are far away, to those closer to home, who might not be experiencing the same level of poverty, but still have serious problems that they need help with. Take friendship, for example. As is pretty cogently argued by Aristotle, friendship adds an awful lot of good to the world. It increases people's well-being, it creates communities that can do great things, and it can push us all to be more virtuous people. But Aristotle also points out that it's in the very nature of friendship that we treat our friends as more morally important than strangers. Friendship involves putting their interests above the interests of others, and even above our own, even when, if we were thinking purely objectively, that might not be the most utilitarian thing to do. This is part of a family of objections to utilitarianism that come up more generally. If we follow the utilitarian principle of maximizing well-being in every case, then we will end up destroying institutions that maximize well-being in the long term. According to critics, this makes utilitarianism self-refuting. Utilitarians then often respond by saying that if these institutions genuinely contribute to more gross well-being, then we should guard them. However, in the case of Singer's position, the argument has a more specific claim. Ignoring our special duties to our family and our friends will make the world more worse off than if we stuck by them. So we ought to prioritize these people above strangers to a certain extent. But it is an open question just how much this actually impacts Singer's argument. Most of us make luxury purchases that are not for the benefit of our children or our friends or our loved ones, but are instead purely for some trivial pleasure of our own. Once again, I'll take myself as an example, just because I'm more comfortable calling calling myself a bad person than anyone else. A couple of weeks ago, I bought a coffee for about £3, and there are probably loads of mini purchases like these that, if I added them up, could do a lot of good if I donated them to charity, while they only offer marginal benefit to me. The idea that we have special obligations to those close to us may stop us from donating our children's Christmas presents to buy malaria nets, but much of Singer's argument remains completely untouched. There are also criticisms of Singer's argument that I call fair share objections. These thinkers agree that we should be doing more to alleviate global poverty and other issues of similar seriousness, but that we should not be obliged to do any more than our fair share. So for any given issue, you take the total amount of money needed, divide it by the number of people that can give, and you're obliged to give that much and no more. Singer is similarly unconvinced by this argument. He says that if there were 5 drowning children in a pond and 5 adults around the outside of the pond, but 4 of them refuse to do anything to save the children from drowning, you could not hang up your coat after saving just one, declaring that you'd done your fair share. And if we did do this, many people would condemn us anyway, saying that our concerns about doing more than our fair share are simply childish. Lastly, there is the simple objection that since Singer's conclusion seems so absurd, his first premise, that we are morally compelled to help people in need unless that incurs some significant moral cost, must be incorrect. This turns Singer's modus ponens argument into a modus tollens argument. Whereas Singer says these premises are true, so the conclusion follows, his opponent says the conclusion is false, so one of the premises must be wrong. I will leave it up to you to decide just how persuasive this argument is in the context of Singer's article. I obviously cannot solve the debate around Singer's philosophy here. Famine, Affluence and Morality remains one of the most controversial papers in modern philosophy, but I do think there are some key takeaways, and that is just what we're going to move on to next. 5. Moral intuitions, reason, and altruism. One of the reasons Singer's paper has become legendary is because it reveals a tension within our moral intuitions. The persuasiveness of the argument rests on the strength of our moral intuition that saving a child at the cost of an expensive suit is a no-brainer. But the radical nature of the conclusion drawn from this seems very unintuitive, to the extent that it has caused some to reject the initial view that saving the child is obligatory. And this raises an important question. What is the role that moral intuitions should play in our view of what is right and wrong? In some sense, they seem indispensable. A lot of ethical arguments are of the form action A seems wrong and B is sufficiently similar to action A, so action B is probably also wrong. But at the same time, it seems like our moral intuitions are fallible. Otherwise, all morals would be completely obvious. The very reason that people have disagreements about the trolley problem or lying for the greater good or Singer's paper is because either our moral intuitions diverge or people think that some moral intuitions are correct while others are incorrect. Singer's argument brings this question at the very heart of ethics to life, as it takes something very intuitive and, through a short series of logical steps, arrives at something very unintuitive. A lot of ethicists think that some combination of moral intuitions and reason inform our moral views, but the interplay between these factors is a matter of great debate, even if that debate sometimes goes unstated. How much rational argument should someone need to abandon a moral intuition? And how much moral intuition does it take to turn a supposedly sound moral argument into a reductio ad absurdum of its initial premises? These are open questions that are highlighted exceptionally well by Singer's paper. Secondly, it raises how much of an issue practicality should be for an ethical theory. Does it matter for Singer's argument that the level of giving that he sees as the moral bare minimum is unlikely to ever be commonplace? Should our ethical theorists worry about what is practical, or should they design ideal worlds and insist that we live up to them? Singer considers himself a practical ethicist, but he is in some way less concerned with the interplay between practical and ethical concerns than the philosophers who reject his argument on the very basis that it is impractical. But again, it is an open question to what extent ethicists should even care about practical consideration. Clearly, what is not what should be, but should what should be have any care for what is? Or should it simply be a study of the ideal, with no consideration for what people are actually like or what they actually do? Lastly, Singer's paper encourages us to question whether we are living up to our own values. Are we truly good people if we look our own moral standards in the face? Or are we still falling far short of them? Do we condemn others for sins that we ourselves commit? And are we guilty of a form of moral hypocrisy, where we accuse other people of being immoral for not caring about our issue of choice, all the while we let millions die through our own inaction? Though this was certainly not Singer's whole intention, I think that his paper does a wonderful job of turning our moral spotlight onto ourselves and making us think about what moral stains we have accrued over time. As always, I encourage you to look into the debate around Singer's paper for yourselves. A very good resource for this is Singer Under Fire, as it includes a great many responses to Singer's paper, as well as his counter-responses. And if you want an imaginative critique of utilitarianism, check out this video on Dostoevsky's Crime and and punishment, to see where the great Russian author thought these moral theories inevitably lead. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.